Hello and welcome to the E.Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Grimsby Town by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, Scott Dan and Martin Kelly after the game. So let's begin. For the second time this week, Jordan Ayew left it late to win it for his team as Palace edged past the spirited 10-man Grimsby Town and advanced into the F.A Cup fourth round. Despite playing with an extra man for 88 minutes following Andrew Fox's VAR assisted dismissal, it looked as though Roy Hodgson's team would require a replay at Blundell Park, despite peppering the Mariners' goal throughout the contest, including striking the post 3 times. However, in the 86th minute, substitute Ayew popped up to head home from a free kick to net in successive gains for the Eagles and squeeze past the League 2 outfit. VAR was being used at Sellers Park for the first time, and just 2 minutes into the game it would affect the whole cup tie. Andrew Fox lunged into Andros Townsend and his studs caught the Palace winger nastily on the ankle, and just as Martin Atkinson seemed satisfied to produce a yellow card, VAR official Jonathan Moss suggested that a red card should have been issued instead, and Fox was sent for a very early bath. That might have caused many to believe that the game would be a formality for the hosts, especially when Alexander Sorloth saw a header cleared off the line by Reece Hall-Johnson soon after. But Palace received a big scare when Wes Thompson popped up at the back post to connect with a cross, but could only divert the ball well wide. However, the chances soon began piling up, and before the midway point of the first half, Jeffrey Subbard hit the side netting before setting up Sorloth who shuffled the ball wide. Wilfred Zaha then forced James McNoe to make a save with his legs, and Max Myers saw a header brush the post with McNoe denying Sorloth with the rebound. Continuing with the theme of the Eagles' season, the woodwork was struck again on 32 minutes through an unlikely source, when Martin Kelly hit a low left footer towards the bottom corner which McNoe tipped over onto the woodwork before claiming, and then Jeffrey Slupp jinked his way into the box from the left flank but blazed into the White Horse Lane end. For all the Eagles' efforts, they couldn't quite find the breakthrough their dominance merited thanks to some misfortune and resolute Grimsby defending, but the game continued in the same vein after the restart, and seconds into the second half, Sorloth stooped to nod just wide, and Kelly once again took aim from range and forced McNoe to beat the ball away. On the hour mark, the post was hit for a third time when Townsend whipped in a cross which Choku Kuyate got his head onto, but again the goal frame wasn't on the Eagles' side. And then the winger tried to add a second stunner to his ever-growing collection when he drilled in a shot from 30 yards which whistled just over the crossbar, and then sent a curler wide of the mark. As the shot count crept towards the 30 mark, Scott Dan was next to go close when his goal-bound effort bent away from the target from range, but 4 minutes from time the breakthrough was finally found. Ayew won a free kick which was curled into the area by Slupp, and his fellow Ghanaian was there to head past McNoe and ensure the Eagles' place in round 4. Grimsby's efforts were acknowledged by the strong nearly 20,000 crowd at full time, with a large number staying behind to sportingly clap off the 4th tier side off the pitch, having come so close to earning a replay with 10 men before Ayew settled matters. So I'm now going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at E.Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. So if you are someone like me who's obviously uses social media quite regularly, and of course you want another Palace account to follow where you can get all the latest news, whether that be transfer news, interviews, general news about the clubs, even some sort of opinions as well, which we put out, before games, after games. If you are someone who wants another Palace account to follow to get all of this stuff, all the latest news, and of course you can follow us on both our Twitter and Facebook pages at E.Crystal Palace. And like I said already, especially during the transfer window, we do regularly update it with every single sort of link Palace get to players coming in or out. So if you are someone who wants up-to-date information about transfers, about anything about the club, as well as just another page on social media to follow where you can obviously read others' opinion, then of course you can do that there, because we've got a team of people. Obviously I do the podcast, but there are other people behind the scenes who do run the social media accounts. So if you do want to read someone else's opinion rather than mine in the podcast, then of course do head over to Twitter at E.Crystal Palace, and of course you can get your opinion on there. Now another great place to share your opinion is in the YouTube comments, so if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings where you rate your players' performances from 1 to 10. Now of course this is just so I can compare my opinion of how I thought the players performed to compare it to yours, so quite honestly I want to hear what you guys had to thought about the game, how you thought the players performed. So that's the reason I want you to get involved with, putting your player ratings in the comment section, basically so I can quite simply compare how you thought the players performed, compare it to my own. And even if you don't want to do that, then do feel free just to comment below with your general views of the game. You know, even if you're a Grimsby fan coming to the channel just for this video, comment below with your views of the game, because I think Grimsby fans, they can't really be that aggrieved because they played really well and made it really difficult for us in the game. So you've got to give a lot of praise to Grimsby, albeit it was disappointing that they got knocked out and got a player sent off, but actually in the grand scheme of things they played very well, made it very difficult for us, and obviously it was just a goal in the last sort of minutes or so which led to us going through. So if you do want to comment below with your player ratings, then of course do feel free to do that, or if you just want to, you know, comment below with your general views of the game, then also feel free to do that. And one of the main reasons for that is, yes, I obviously have my view of the game, but of course I want to read what you guys thought about the game, compare that to my own opinion, and also any other fans who come to the video, whether they be Grimsby or Palace fans, rather than them just listening to my view in the podcast, they can actually read the comment section and just see what everyone else is thinking as well, have a bit of a discussion. And you know, that's what I really like. I like to have discussions with people, especially in games like this where, you know, both teams played relatively well. So of course do feel free to get involved there. And if you do have any questions for me, whether that be about the game, whether that be about something I've said, or whether it be about a player's performance or transfers, anything like that that you want me to answer for you, then of course also feel free to drop that below. Now before I go on to talk about the player ratings, I might as well just put a little disclaimer here like I do for every single cup game. Obviously, as this is a cup game, albeit the FA Cup is slightly more important than the Carabao Cup, but as this is a cup game, I'm not really going to go into too much detail, as not everyone else is interested in the cup, because obviously the main target is to stay in the league. But of course it'd be nice to go on a cup run this year, and I think the fact that we've played quite well in the Carabao Cup, albeit the Middlesbrough game weren't that great, but aside from that we played quite well and we actually went for that cup. So if we can go for the cup and actually go on a cup run this year, then maybe a few more people will be a bit more excited in it. But nevertheless, not as many people are as interested in the cup games, mainly because the league is priority, and I understand that. But when you consider, you know, the team we put out on Saturday gave us a really good chance to actually go at it and actually try and, you know, show Grimsby that we're not sort of there to take the mickey of them. We're there to play a full strength side against them, albeit a few players mixed around. So the fact that we actually went for it showed that we're actually looking to go on a cup run, and considering Hodgson's comments, we are looking to go on that as well. So albeit not everyone is interested in it, I'm just going to go in a little bit less detail, obviously, for those who don't like it. And like I've said, if you do want to get a little bit more detailed, then of course, you know, feel free to send questions to me in the comment section below. Now, another reason why I'm not going to go into too much detail is just because of how boring the game was, and that was just because of how well Grimsby defended. Now, of course, they went down to 10 men, got a player sent off via VAR within like 2 minutes of the game, and of course that changed the whole complexion, because rather than Grimsby playing defensive and actually just trying to go forward, they basically had to just park the bus because they lost a man in defence. Now obviously that's understandable, but it just made them play so much more defensive, which made it even harder for us, and obviously made it harder for them to actually go forward. So if anything, it made it hard for Palace to play against 10 men, because it obviously meant that Grimsby had to play more defensive than they sort of already were when they were going to approach the game. So for that reason, it was quite boring, and despite them having 10 men, the fact that they put a good account of themselves is obviously credit to them. And although a few of their fans are a bit bitter, a bit salty on Twitter, you've actually got to look at the performance as a whole and go, actually, they actually played really well, and actually the fact that they contained us for about 87 minutes or so is a real credit to them, considering they obviously had one less man. And one of the other reasons why it was quite a boring game is the fact that we had 30 shots in the game, I believe so, and the fact that we just wasted chances. You know, we had ones hit the post, we've had other ones which were quite easy for the goalkeeper. So once again, just showing that lack of clinical edge we have in front of the goal in that final third of the minute, once again coming up to show. And considering it's against League 2 opposition, it's a bit disappointing. But when you consider we're playing a second string side with a few first team players in there, because they haven't really played together that much, you can understand them not necessarily playing that well. But nevertheless, a little bit disappointing the fact that we had 30 shots and only scored 1 goal. But when you consider, you know, Grimsby defended very well, sat very deep, were very difficult to break down. And when you consider when we started putting crosses into the box, we eventually started to actually, you know, get chances in the box. The fact that our goal came from a cross really just goes to show that actually the only way we were ever going to break Grimsby down was by, you know, getting the target men in the box. So people like Connor Wickham, getting people like Ayew, albeit he's not the tallest man, but getting people like them in the box and just put crosses in. And when we did, we ended up scoring. So it really just goes to show that actually Grimsby defended really well, but if we had just taken that initiative, we would have put more crosses into the box earlier on into the game, because maybe something better would have come off it. But overall, I do think it was quite a good cup tie. You know, 20,000 people at Selhurst, you know, nearly 6,000 Grimsby fans as well. So it was a great atmosphere. albeit not the greatest game on the pitch, but at the end of the day we're through to the next round, and obviously that's really all that matters. So I'm going to move on now to the player ratings, obviously my slightly shorter version than I would normally do. Going to start in goal with Wayne Hennessy, obviously coming back into the side. Going to give him a 6 overall, mainly because he wasn't really tested on his return to the team, and obviously because he hasn't played in a few weeks, you could understand maybe he'd be a bit off, but the fact that he came into the side, put a good account of himself, albeit he wasn't really tested because of just how well we were just sort of putting on the pressure on Grimsby. Because of that, he wasn't really tested, and actually, even though he wasn't tested, the fact that the 2 chances or the 2 occasions where he was mainly called upon, the fact that he kept his concentration to deny Elliot Embleton in each half, so in the first half he had a chance, in the second half as well. So the fact that he was able to, even though he wasn't being tested, but when he was called upon, the fact that he kept his concentration and was still able to make the saves to deny the player was obviously good as well. So the fact that Hennessy was able to not do much in the game, but when called upon was able to do it and help us get that clean sheet was of course great to see. And in terms of just our defensive record, albeit it was a changed back 4 for this game, the fact that we've kept yet another clean sheet, albeit against a League 2 side, it still goes to show how good our defensive record is this season, and the fact that we're quite good now at actually keeping clean sheets, being solid at the back, whatever the personnel in there. And certainly Hennessy, Gaeta, this season they've both put good accounts of themselves, and certainly Hennessy here hasn't necessarily done anything bad in terms of trying to get back into the side, but when you consider he wasn't really tested, we can't really say too much about his performance there. So Wayne Hennessy here, not really tested, but made good saves and kept concentration in the first and second half to make particular saves, so I do think 6 overall is fair. Obviously Joe Ward came in at right back, going to give him a 6 overall. Obviously Elliot Embleton was probably one of Grimsby's best players in the game in terms of their forward play, and obviously Joe Ward had his hands full in terms of dealing with him, and for the most part he dealt with him relatively well, so that's one of the reasons I've given him a 6. And when you consider, you know, he hasn't played in a while, the fact that he performed like he did to a respectable standard, kept a clean sheet, was of course great to see. Now, one of the things I was a little bit disappointed with is the fact that he didn't provide as much of a threat down the right as I would have liked, and obviously there's 2 aspects to this. Obviously the first one is getting up there, and he done that perfectly fine. I was sitting in the main stand and I could literally see him every time he was going forward, he was always going down the flank, which was fine. But when he did get to the byline, or when he did get into the final third, rather than looking to cross the ball, he just passed it back to midfield, back to the centre back. So rather than us actually looking to actually make these attacks down the right hand side and cross the ball in, Joe Ward was a bit disappointing in that aspect. And you know, goes back to what I said already, in the fact that we ended up scoring from a cross into the box when we started putting crosses in towards the end of the game. I'm sure if Joe Ward had actually run to the byline, put more crosses in, albeit his crossing was not great, but if he had done that early on in the game, maybe we would have had a few more chances. Because you look at Connor Wickham, you look at Soloff, these are guys in the game had headers, even Kuyate as well, had headers from balls crossed into the area, so we should have really been looking to do that earlier. But yes, he obviously was in the right areas offensively, but wasn't looking to put crosses in. And obviously the few crosses he did put in, they ultimately didn't lead into anything. So really, on the few occasions where he was actually doing what, you know, me and quite a lot of people around me were wanting him to do, of course something good came off of it. But I suppose the only good thing of that is, yes, he wasn't looking to cross into the box, but when he was passing back quite a few times, you know, especially in that second half, Kuyate was looking to cross into the box as well. So albeit Joe Ward's crossing isn't great, but it would have been better to see him at least attempt to get the ball into the box. So I'm going to move on now to our first centre-back, Scott Dann, obviously making his return into the side. I'm going to give him a 7 overall because I was really impressed with him. And certainly the fact that he hasn't played a proper first-team match in about a year, the fact that he came in, played as well as he did, albeit he wasn't necessarily tested by Grimsby, was obviously quite impressive. Now obviously his injury was quite serious, you know, going back to that against Man City last year it was. Also, it was 2 years ago now technically. So obviously that was a bit disappointing. He obviously out for a year and a bit, and of course he's now built himself up a bit, and you know, the fact that he's now able to play a game like this, albeit in the FA Cup against lower league opposition, but the fact that he can come into the side after being out for so long was of course great to see. And the fact that he spent so long on the sidelines and come into a game like this just shows, you know, how his recovery seems to be, you know, going. And you look at someone like Connor Wickham, who when he recovered from injuries he seemed to have minor step backs, whereas Scott Dann here seemed to, even though he was a bit slower to get fit, let's say, the fact that he's done it and now coming to the side now and actually performing like this was of course great to see. Now, to be honest, he probably, as a centre-back, couldn't have asked for only 90 minutes, and that's just because Grimsby weren't really testing him, so that's something you'd expect when you consider that we were just camped in Grimsby's half. So you can understand on the rare foray forward they did get, because our centre-backs are fairly competent, they were able to deal with it, and obviously that's what they did for the whole game. And, you know, yes, he didn't have too much defending to do, and that's just because Grimsby weren't necessarily going for that much. But one of the reasons for that, like I've already said, just because they got that early got that early red card, we're down to 10 men, and because of that, rather than them just playing defensive, they literally played even more defensive, which obviously played into their hands, because it basically meant they defended even better than they probably would have had playing with the full 11, because they probably would have tried to attack us more. So ultimately, one of the reasons why Scotland's job was so easy was obviously because of that red card and the fact that Grimsby Town was sitting so deep. But one of the things I liked about his performance, and the main reason I've given him a 7 as opposed to a 6, which I've given to Joe Ward, who was also very good defensively, is just because he served a threat actually going forward as well. And especially from set pieces, I was really impressed with Scott Dan's presence. And, you know, obviously we know before he got injured, he was always good in the air, always good from corners. And this season, we've actually been lacking that. So with the fact that we've had someone like Scott Dan come back into the side and actually show what we've been missing in terms of being a threat from set pieces was, of course, great to see. Now, you know, one of the reasons why I was so impressive in this game was not just because he was being a threat from set pieces, it's just the fact that he won loads of crucial headers from corners and set pieces, you know, running to the far post, putting the ball back in, or obviously hitting it goalwards. So the fact that he was doing that when we haven't necessarily been able to do that this season was, of course, good to see. And the fact that he also had an effort cleared off the line as well just goes to show that actually he is actually proving a threat going forward, as well as just doing his job defensively as well. So the fact that we've got someone like Scott down here putting a very competent defensive performance, albeit he wasn't really tested, whilst also, you know, posing a threat from set pieces as well, was of course great to see. Now his centre-back partner was Martin Kelly, who obviously I've talked about quite a lot this season, because when he's come into the side for people like Tompkins, he's actually done really well. So the fact that he come into this side here, we weren't really we weren't really expecting him to not play bad, because he always is a very good, competent player who can come into the side and do a job for you. So the fact that Martin Kelly's Mr. Reliable, I suppose, he can always come in, you can always rely on him, was of course great to see. And much like Scott Dan, I've given him a 7 because of just how well they'd done defensively. And, you know, even though they weren't really called into action in terms of the defensive abilities, on the rare foray forward that Grimsby did have, the fact that they dealt with it so well and were able to, you know, off the back of that, carry the ball forward was of course great to see. And, you know, it goes back to that point once again, the fact that they were reduced to 10 men so early on in the game basically meant they played more defensive than they would have done originally, which obviously restricted them going forward, made the lives of the two centre-backs and the back four as a whole obviously much more difficult. But of course, you know, going back to that point I made about him being Mr. Reliable, he obviously also had the initiative as well in this game too, because he wasn't really being tested defensively, which of course he's normally very good at. He just showed his initiative by actually driving forward and actually shooting from distance as well. Now on both occasions where he shot from distance, obviously the whole crowd was saying shoot, he took a shot, and obviously James McNone actually made 2 saves as well. Obviously the first one made a save, tipped it onto the post, and the other one was just a simple save there. So the fact that Martin Kelly was able to do his defensive duties, albeit he wasn't really tested, whilst also actually showing that initiative to drive forward because they were so hard to break down, and the fact that he was combining that with having shots from distance was of course great to see. And, you know, the first one in that first half, if it hadn't have been for that little touch by McNone, it probably would have gone into the bottom corner, and obviously the second one was a fairly easy save. But nevertheless, the fact that Kelly was able to come into the side, Mr. Reliable, like he always does, puts in a very good performance, whilst also actually just proving that threat going forward as well, by actually trying his hardest to actually put pressure on the back four of Grimsby to try and break them down was of course great to see. So we're going to move on now to the final player of our back four, and that is Papa Soiree at left back. Going to give him a 5 overall, and the main reason for this is because he went off injured in that first half, and also because the time he was on the pitch, he impressed me with some aspects of his play, but in other aspects he was quite disappointing. So I do think overall 5 is sort of a fair result. Now, quite a few times Wes Thomas actually got the better of Papa Soiree, and, you know, when you consider he hasn't necessarily played that much since he's had his injury, you can understand him being a bit rusty, and certainly I could understand that being the case. But when you consider, you know, he still played all right in some of the Carabao Cup games, you'd expect him to do a little bit better against, you know, League 2 opposition here. No disrespect to Grimsby, but, you know, when you've got them sitting as far deep as they are, you would expect someone like Papa Soiree to actually go, you know, go bomb forward like he always used to do, put balls into the box. But he really was lacking that in the game, and we didn't really see the best of him. And, you know, he combined that that sort of lacklustre defensive performance with the fact that he wasn't really that good going forward, and then he obviously got injured off the back of that. And I do think his injury, I wouldn't say it's too serious because that's what Hodgson said, but there's some rumours going around that he has to have surgery on it. So of course he's had a really unlucky break again with an injury, in the fact that he's probably going to be out for even longer now. even though he probably isn't going to be in the side anytime soon. But he does, obviously, the fact that he started this game here shows that he can you know, show up and actually play in the cup games as well. But like I've said already, the fact that he obviously got substituted because of that injury, obviously that shoulder injury, and the fact that he was just caught out a few times by Wes Thomas in particular, and obviously, yes, the offside flag was obviously shown up on more than one occasion, but you know, you would expect better from someone who's, even though he's had the injuries he's had, you'd expect better from someone who's obviously played in the Premier League and played in top leagues as long as he has. But overall, Papa Soare, slightly disappointing in the fact that he went off with the injury, but like I've said, probably considering the time he was on the pitch, he probably could have done more offensively to actually try and put crosses into the box, because, you know, like I've said, because Grimsby was sitting so deep in the game, it obviously made our lives overall difficult. But overall, Papa Soare, slightly disappointing performance from him, but I do think a 5 is a fair reflection. So I'm going to move on now to our midfield, and I'm going to start with Andros Townsend, who I am going to give a 6 overall. Now, I suppose before I go on to talk about his performance against Grimsby, I might as well say that actually when the lineup was announced, it was quite surprising to see both Townsend and Zaha start this game, obviously because you don't want to risk 2 of your best players actually getting injured in the cup. But obviously they came out of the game fine, but nevertheless it was obviously a bit worrying to obviously see us risking them. But obviously it was also a very positive thing to see that actually we were trying to throw everything at the cup and we were taking it very seriously. So you saw other Premier League sides make loads of changes, put youth sides out. So the fact that we made minimal changes whilst also keeping in some of our players who play week in, week out was of course great to see. But of course we did have play that with that risk that they could have got injured. And obviously Townsend was obviously on the end of Andrew Fox's challenges, which, you know, he obviously got sent off for that. But on another day, if he had connected slightly differently, that could have been a leg breaker. So that sort of moment in particular showed actually the risk we were doing by actually putting out some of our first team players. But overall, Andros Townsend, I've given him a 6 because I do think he was relatively effective in the game. Not as much as he's been in Premier League games recently, but you can understand because of how well Grimsby defended, you know, their resilience, as well as the fact they were just sitting very deep and absorbing all the pressure. It made it difficult, not just for Townsend, but for the whole of our attacking players. And of course, because we were putting so much pressure on them, even some of our midfield players were essentially playing as strikers because they were so far up the pitch. But obviously in terms of Townsend, you know, 2 minutes into the game he obviously had that foul from Andrew Fox, and whether that had an effect on him I'm not sure, but maybe it could have. But luckily he obviously came off the right end of that and obviously didn't get injured off that. But I suppose in terms of that happened really early on in the first half, and then a few moments later he had a great cross into the box for Sorloth, and obviously that Sorloth didn't quite finish that chance there, which I'll go on to talk about Sorloth later on. So the fact that Townsend still had, you know, had that near miss in terms of the injury early on in the game, the fact that he was still able to put that behind him, put in a fine cross for Sorloth in the game a few moments later was of course great to see, albeit Sorloth didn't finish it off. But then as the game wore on, you can understand him fading, and the fact that he's played loads of games over the festive period, and that's exactly what happened. You know, he started the game quite lively, like when he put in that cross for Sorloth, but as the game wore on he sort of faded, and understandably, considering all of the games he's played recently, he obviously became less effective. And you know, when you consider as the game went on it's 0-0, we want to try and get the goal, you'd expect someone like Townsend or someone like Zaha to actually just step forth, make it count, and obviously for them to actually go forth and get the goal, which ultimately Jordan Ayew did. But, you know, we would have expected someone like Townsend or Zaha, who plays in, week out, to actually be the guy who could actually do that. But overall, you know, he had obviously that injury. It could have been an injury earlier on in the game. Luckily it wasn't, with obviously that challenge from Andrew Fox. Putting a good cross into Sorloth quite early on into the game, which of course he missed. And aside from a few sort of shots from about 25-30 yards, which obviously went over, other than that, wasn't really too much from Townsend. But, you know, when you compare it to someone else, some of our other players' performances, the fact that he still put himself about a bit, considering the fact that he's probably fatigued from the amount of games he's playing, as well as just the fact that you would expect better from him, I do think a 6 overall is a fair reflection overall. Now, Max Meyer was one of the players who obviously we all put into our predicted lineups because he hasn't played much in the Premier League in the last few games, so understandably he came into the side here, and although I was expecting a little bit more from him, the fact that he was quite involved quite early on, and the fact that he obviously saw a header hit the post, the fact that he had a few chances here, I do think a 6 overall is a fair result. Now obviously people are criticising him, and especially Zaha as well, so they're criticising them for the same reason, in the fact that they even though it was a lower league opposition, they weren't playing again as good as against them that they have done previously. They weren't really putting pressure on them like they've done with previous players, so of course that was slightly disappointing. But actually, if you look at Meyer's performance and the fact that it was relatively difficult to break Grimsby down, it's understandable that your creative midfielder is actually going to struggle. And I do think the fact that like I've said, they were playing very deep, obviously made it difficult for players like him. So actually, if you give him the benefit of the doubt, he actually had a relatively good performance. That's why I've given him a 6. And the main reason for that is because of how early on, when we were trying to get that first goal, especially sort of in that first half, he was heavily involved in that, in lots of our build-up play. And albeit it didn't come to anything, but the fact that he had that attack in the 10, albeit people would say, oh, he's not a very good player because this was a very lacklustre performance from him, didn't look to do anything. But actually, if you look at the first half, I personally think that he was heavily involved quite early on, and the fact that he, even though he's one of the shortest players on the field, the fact that he actually had a header which was hit the post, obviously just goes to show that actually, yes, he's not the tallest player, but he actually can be a threat inside the box. And it just goes back to that point I said earlier on, you know, I do think we probably would have won the game comfortably by maybe 2-3 goals if we had crossed the ball into the box more, because if we had done that, we've got Tiger Man in the box who could have headed the goal. So it just goes to show that people like Sorloth had headers, albeit some of them went wide, some of them hit the post. Someone like Meyer as well also had a header hit the post. So it just goes back to that game plan. Maybe we should have been looking to get more balls into the box. But the main reason I was impressed with Meyer's performance, albeit not everyone was impressed, but personally for me, the fact that he made a number of good runs down the channels, looking to actually get the play going, albeit he couldn't necessarily do that because of how deep Grimsby were playing. Even though that was the case, I do think it was a good performance from him, and I do think some of the criticism he is getting is a bit unfair, because personally for me, difficult circumstances because of the team literally putting 9 men behind the ball. So really for me, it's understandable why he played like that. But the fact that we've seen his quality in the Premier League this season obviously just goes to show that actually, you know, he's not a bad player. It was just one of these games where the opposition obviously defended really well against him. Now, Jar Riedewald obviously playing again in midfield alongside Meyer, one of these players who everyone put in their predicted lineup, mainly because he hasn't played much this season, and of course he's played all the other cup games this season. Now, in terms of his performance here, I'm going to give him a 6 overall, and that's just because, much like Meyer, yes, he wasn't the greatest in the game, but he was still looking to do stuff, especially early on in the game. So for that reason, I do think he gets, I do think a 6 overall is a fair result. And when you consider, much like Meyer, he's coming up for a little bit of criticism because he was looking to play the ball back quite a lot in the game, wasn't really looking as energetic as he has done previously. Yes, that was the case, but like I've said, because Grimsby were playing so deep, it made it difficult for all of our players to actually look like they're doing anything positive, in the fact that we just had to try and pass the ball to basically get around Grimsby. So obviously Riedewald playing in midfield, he was one of the players where quite a lot of our balls did come from, because obviously he was like the centre point, the pivot of our midfield overall. But one of the things I liked about his performance, and this is something that a lot of people don't really discuss, they're just like, he had a bad game, is just the fact that even though he's a defensive midfielder, he actually ventured forward on a couple of occasions, and even though he didn't really show anything that he was actually ready to actually challenge Luka Milivojevic or Cheku Karte for a place in the starting 11 in the Premier League, he still showed glimpses in the fact that yes, he's mainly plays as a defensive midfielder, which obviously is going to make it difficult for him to obviously get in the Premier League side, but the fact that we actually saw him actually try to venture forward, try to be that creator to actually break down Grimsby, so the fact that we saw that was of course great to see. But much like Meyer, it was sort of an under par performance by the standards we've seen from these two players before, and certainly, you know, a really clear indication as to probably why Roy Hodgson hasn't been starting him, in the fact that he might not necessarily had that little bit of magic, or that little moment where he can ping a pass, where of course he can break down the opposition. But like I've said with quite a lot of players, you know, the reason why we played like we did is we were putting loads of pressure on, but because of how well Grimsby were playing, because of how deep they were, it basically made it difficult for all the players. So I'm sure if Grimsby hadn't have been playing so deep, then I'm sure someone like Riedewald could have had an even better game, in the fact that he would just be pinging balls left, right and centre, and maybe something different would have come out from the game. But overall, I do think some of the criticism from him is a little bit unfair. So I do think overall a 6 for his performance, where he was both good defensively and offensively, albeit he was quite negative in the second half, in the fact that he was just passing the ball around as opposed to looking actively to put the ball forward. Even though that was the case with sideward passes, I do think overall 6 is an overall fair result, and I don't necessarily think he's bad, or as bad as some people made out. So now I'm going to move on to our final player in our central midfield, and that was of course Jeffrey Sub, who I'm actually going to give a 7 overall. Now he is obviously a player who most of us did put in our predicted lineups, mainly because he's been relatively hot and cold this season, and obviously quite recently, you know, against Man City in a few games recently, he's been fairly effective. So we thought quite big things from him, considering that actually he was playing in a position where he's actually played quite well this season, and obviously that is in a midfield 3. Obviously as a central midfielder. Now of course he normally plays on the left hand side, but in this game here, like he did against City, like he did against a few clubs this season. He played slightly more central than he normally does, and actually I thought he was one of our most threatening players because of that, and that's why, or one of the reasons I've given him a 7 overall. So the fact that he was playing in this new position, which he obviously done so well against City, obviously really sort of gave us the best of him in the fact that he was one of our most attacking players, most threatening players in that first half. And, you know, you just look at the chances he had in that first half and it really does back that up. You know, he had a shot which went into the side netting, another chance where he put in a cross for Soloff, and another effort which he put just wide. So he's had 3 chances in particular, which really just goes to show that actually in this position he seems to utilise his skills more. And that's the main reason I've given him a 7, is the fact that, yes, he may not have been outstanding, but the fact that he was actually looking to be that attacking threat more than other players in the side was of course great to see. Now of course when Suarez went off with an injury, obviously the obvious substitution was obviously to bring on a midfielder and obviously push Jeffrey Schlupp back to left back, and obviously that's what happened, and there was a little bit of confusion in the fact that Hodgson wasn't quite sure who to sub on at first, or I'm not quite sure what was happening on the bench, but there was a bit of confusion, which meant for about sort of 5 to 8 minutes or so we were playing with 10 men as well, and actually we seemed to play alright against 10 men, mainly because we had the same amount of men as Grimsby, and obviously by actually having the same amount of men, Grimsby sort of were coming a bit more at us, because obviously they knew that we also had 10 men, and it seemed to open up the game a little bit more for that sort of period of 5 to 8 minutes or so. But obviously he moved back to left back, and obviously he didn't get forward as much as he would have liked, and that's just because people in front of him like Zaha, like Townsend, were basically doing that work, trying to get the ball into the box. So because he was playing slightly more deeper, because obviously he was the left back, obviously meant that he sort of negated that sort of attacking threat that he had in the first half. But actually if you put that aside, where he was actually threatening where he was not as threatening in that second half as he was in the first half, I do think overall it was a very good performance. And the thing that he obviously topped it off was you know, that delivery to Ayew to head home. So obviously towards the end of the game, I was sitting in the stand going, all game we need to cross the ball more into the box. What does Jeffrey Schlupp do? We have a set piece, puts in a lovely lofted ball into the box, and obviously Ayew gets a very clean header on it and obviously makes it 1-0. We go on to win the game. So not only was Jeffrey Schlupp threatening throughout the whole game, but when it did matter towards the end of the game, where we really needed to actually get something to stop us going to a replay, the fact that he produced the goods with a fantastic delivery from that set piece was of course great to see. And you know, it just goes back to that point. I was sitting in the stand going, we need to cross more. Joe Ward, Jeffrey Schlupp, you need to cross more to get the ball into the box. They didn't do that, but when he did get a chance from a set piece to cross the ball in, look what happens, hey presto, we end up scoring. So it really just goes to show that actually if we had put more crosses into the box early on in the game, then maybe we wouldn't have had such a difficult game, in the fact that we had to try and wait for a set piece to actually break Grimsby down. And I do think Jeffrey Schlupp, yes, his delivery was great, but if he had, because he showed there how good his deliveries can be, so if he had done that a little bit more early on in the game, of course that would have been better. But overall I was really impressed with his performance, playing in central midfield as well as playing at left back. But like I've said already, you know, the fact that he delivered that ball to actually help us to win the game was of course great to see. And once again goes to show that actually, yes, he may not be the best player in the Premier League, but he's a very good utility player in the fact that he can play in multiple positions. And as this game showed here, playing in both midfield and as a left back, he obviously done a relatively good job. Now obviously Wilfried Zaha, you know, much like Andrew Townsend, was a player who we didn't really necessarily expect to start, mainly because we want to protect our players from injury. And unlike Townsend, where Townsend could have got injured from that tackle, there wasn't necessarily any of that sort of stuff on Zaha, so understandably he came out of the game unscathed, luckily. But nevertheless, it was a bit of a risk playing him, but luckily, other than sort of the bit of swelling it looked like on his eye, other than that, he obviously didn't get injured. And you know, one of the reasons why I don't think he got injured is just because he wasn't really as effective as he had been recently. You know, he wasn't really having a go at the centre-backs, wasn't really trying to run and get the ball in behind. So because he wasn't really up to his usual standards by actually putting pressure on the back four of the opposition, because he wasn't really doing that, he wasn't really, you know, testing them, basically meant that he didn't necessarily have any opportunities where he could have got injured, which luckily for us he didn't. But you know, it is really sort of difficult to explain a performance like his, because on the one hand, you could say one of the reasons why he didn't really get injured is because he wasn't really involved in the game. And one of the reasons for that is just because whenever we got the ball forward, we'll pass it to him, he'll try and dribble past players, lose possession, Grimsby pass the ball up the pitch, we intercept it, we end up passing the ball back up the field. So basically it was like a merry-go-round, you know. And rather than Zaha doing what he used to do, you know, looking to be that provider by crossing the ball in or looking to do 1-2s, in this game here, he was a little bit too greedy. And maybe that was one of the other reasons why he wasn't that great. Just the fact that by his usual standards, he likes to run at centre-backs, likes to run in behind, get crosses in. But in this game here, he didn't do that. And one of the reasons for that is just because he was a little bit too greedy, holding on to the ball. And like I've said, the ball got intercepted by Grimsby. They passed it forward, we intercepted it. So it basically was just like a continuous circle of things that were happening. But obviously as the first half wore on, he grew into the game and obviously got slightly better. But the reason I've just given him a 5 is just because he just tried to take on the whole Grimsby defence by himself at times, which of course goes back to that point that he was actually a little bit selfish. So even though in that first half, towards the end of it, he showed glimpses of what he could do in terms of taking on 2 or 3 Grimsby players and getting the ball in the box, but he should have done that throughout the whole game as opposed to trying to just take on the whole team. And we've seen that in the Premier League this season, and obviously he needs to sort of cut that out of his game, because we've seen that when he plays great, it's because he has a mix between dribbling past players and passing the ball to others, whereas in this game here it was like 90% of the time he was actually looking to dribble past players and have chances for himself. So if he had been a little bit more generous, a little bit more I don't know how to describe it, but if he had just been looking to actually give the ball to his teammates as opposed to trying to take on the whole team himself, then maybe there would have been a different result. But I do think obviously his performance wasn't that great because he was being too greedy, but then I think on the other hand, because Grimsby were defending as well as they did and because they were so deep, it obviously made life very difficult for him. And when you consider he likes to run at centre backs, you know, when you've got all of your midfielders playing so deep, almost as extra centre backs, it's obviously going to make it more difficult for any player. So obviously it was a very under par performance from him, but on that occasion we might as well give him the benefit of the doubt, because at times he was growing into the game and looked good, but then at other times he was too greedy. So I do think it was sort of a game where he wasn't up to his normal standards. That's why I've given him a 5. But then obviously there were other parts of the game where he was good, but it was a little bit too greedy. So I do think overall 5 is a fair result. And obviously once again, going back to what I said at the weekend, his long wait to actually score a goal for us obviously continues. So we're going to move on now to our final player, and that is Alexander Sorloth. Going to give him a 5 overall because he's another player who come up for quite a lot of criticism, but I just think he wasn't as bad as people made out, but he obviously wasn't excellent as well, and he was below average, but people are making out as if he was absolutely terrible. But actually, I don't think he was as bad as people make out. This game sort of highlighted to me is not his lack of quality, it's just the fact that he's not necessarily quite up to the standard to English football quite yet. So as opposed to people saying he's absolutely terrible, we should sell him, it was terrible by the board to actually sign him in the first place, the way I look at it is the fact that yes, he wasn't really playing well, but I don't think it's because he's a bad player, because we signed him because he had scored like 12 to 15 goals where he was playing. It wasn't because he was a bad player we signed him because of that good form, and it just seems here where he's lost a bit of confidence, isn't really playing that great, and maybe it's just for the simple fact that he maybe isn't up to the quality of the English league, or maybe it's just the fact that he's got a lack of confidence, and you know, the fact that he's not getting that many chances doesn't really seem to be helping out. But in terms of his performance here, I actually think he started the game really, really well. Had a header cleared off the line, which of course, going back to that point, we didn't put enough crosses into the box, but on the few times we did, we actually came closest to scoring. So if we had done that a little bit more in the game, then maybe Sorloth would have been a little bit more impressive in the fact that he would have had a few more chances. So the fact that the one time we put a cross into the box, the fact that we came really close to scoring by him actually having that header cleared off the line, and another one where the ball fell to him and the goalkeeper made a save. So there's 2 chances there where he's been relatively unlucky. So while people are saying he's really bad, he should be finishing them, the fact that he actually got more chances or had better chances, which obviously forced the keeper into a save compared to other players, really is a good thing to see. Now, one of the other things that really did impress me, and this is something that most people will just sort of put aside and say, oh, it's rubbish, it's just his link-up play was quite impressive in the fact that he'd, rather than actually playing quite far up and actually waiting for the ball to get to him, he'd actually come quite deep, carry the ball forward, you know, pick it up, as well as a few times where he was actually drifting out wide to actually make from between the defence by, you know, letting people like Zaha and Townsend get in between. So albeit it wasn't the greatest in the game, hence why I've given him a 5, there were glimpses of things that were good in terms of his headering ability and the fact that his link-up play and the fact that he was actually running down the channels. Yes, that was great, but obviously the fact that he missed a few gilt-edged chances in that first half, and obviously there was another one in that second half where he sent a header wide. So the fact that he started well, the fact that he couldn't quite, you know, maintain that for the rest of the game, a slightly drifted down towards the end of the game was the thing that was really quite disappointing. And like I've said, people are absolutely criticising him, saying he's rubbish, but I personally think it's just a thing that because when he came to us, he scored loads of goals, he was getting time on the pitch, he was playing quite well, but because now he hasn't scored in a while, he's losing a bit of confidence, whilst also not getting many chances to play in the first team. That obviously seems to all being sort of combined together as why he's not playing as good as he has done previously. But of course, because of his lacklustre performance on the hour mark, Connor Wickham came on for him. Not really a surprise, but like I've said, I don't think that Sorloth was necessarily bad. I just think it's maybe a lack of confidence thing, or maybe it's just the fact that he's not a bad player, he's just not up to the quality, or in playing in a Premier League team. But even though we were playing against League 2 opposition, the fact still remains that maybe he could be good enough to play against teams like that, but maybe not quite good enough to be in a Premier League team. But yes, we were obviously expecting him to put on a really good showing and actually show us why he should be getting chances in the side. But the fact that he missed a few gilt-edged chances, albeit some of his other chances were quite good, especially when he started well, but the fact that the majority of it was quite disappointing was of course not great to see. And we really wanted him to impress, and I think all fans really want him to do well, but obviously it doesn't really seem to be going that way. And I do think some news came out today that the move to Ghent might be sort of picking up pace now. So of course he goes there on loan, and hopefully he does well there, and hopefully he comes back having been in the first team, getting regular football, and hopefully getting goals. So hopefully he can come back to us even better, because I do think a loan deal is really something he could really benefit off. But overall, Alexander Sorloth, much like Zaha in a certain respect, in the fact that maybe one of the reasons he didn't play that well is because of how well Grimsby defended, but nevertheless I think much like Zaha, had a few chances, then missed a number of chances as well. So I do think for the both of them, and Sorloth in particular, I do think the 5 overall was fair. So we obviously made 3 substitutions in the game. F.A Cup, probably going to give him a 6 overall, because he came on for Soiree and basically just helped us to steady the ship in midfield, and because he's got that physical presence and that presence to really push forward in the midfield, the fact that he'd done that when he came on just before the break, and the fact that in the second half he was actually looking to get us further forward and looking to actually try and get us to break down Grimsby. So the fact that he was doing that once coming on for Papa Soiree, who of course was injured, was of course great to see. And because he was driving so far forward, he obviously got into the box a few times. And when, like I said, going back to that point, we didn't put enough crosses in the box, but when we did, Cheku Kuyate got on the end of one of them and it struck the post before going out of play. So it just goes to show that we created loads of chances in the game. We had 30 shots, but when we didn't actually do enough of the opportunities where we went to the byline, got the ball into the box, and when we did, obviously chances like that one for Kuyate actually almost went in. So it just goes back to that point that, yes, it's slightly disappointing that we failed to break down Grimsby, and the fact that we only scored sort of the last few minutes or so, but you've got to give credit to them because of how well they defended. But also you've got to look at us and go, yes, we were looking to go forward, but we weren't looking to go forward in the right places. But rather than breaking Grimsby down the middle, we should have been looking to put balls out wide and get the crosses in, because as shown by Cheku Kuyate, as shown by Sorloth as well, these are players who actually had chances once the ball was in the box. But overall, Cheku Kuyate, 6 for him, came on for the injured Papa Soiree, helped us to see the game out, and of course gave us that little bit more presence and a little bit more tenacity, let's say, going forward, in the fact that he was able to carry the ball forward. And albeit Grimsby made it very difficult for us, he obviously made it a little bit more easier to break them down overall. Connor Wickham obviously came on for Sorloth, and I'm probably going to give him a 6 overall. He came on obviously on the hour mark, and the fact that he put himself about a bit, and yes, he couldn't quite get a goal, but the fact that he done much what was similar to what Sorloth did, in the fact that he was looking to get in the box, looking to get on the end of chances, was of course great to see. But it goes back to that point again about crosses. You've got someone like Connor Wickham who's obviously come on for Sorloth. You've got someone like him who's really good at headering and really good at actually having that physicality to actually barge off defenders. So rather than actually looking to get the ball down the middle, we should have been getting crosses in. And there was a few times when we got crosses in and Connor Wickham obviously headed them goalwards. Yes, obviously they didn't go in, but it goes back to that point that actually most of our the chances we had from corners were the closest we probably came to scoring from anything in the game. So it really goes back to that point that you can't really criticise players too much, like Wickham, like Sorloth, mainly because that we didn't really put in, or we didn't really supply them in a way which would have benefited them. So you go back to Sorloth in particular, compare him to Wickham. If anything, I should really be giving them sort of similar ratings, in the fact that they came on, they were a tiger man, which was great, but they missed chances. But then if we had supplied them more, like on the few occasions, then maybe something different would have happened. But I do think Connor Wickham came on. Yes, he didn't necessarily change the game drastically, but going back to his injury, which I've been talking about in recent weeks. The fact that he's now getting minutes under his belt, and you know, week in or every week he seems to be coming on the pitch for even longer periods, so he seems to be building up his fitness. And if he can carry on that way, whilst also we actually play to his strengths to actually get the ball to him in the first place, then maybe good things were to come from him in the future. Now, of course, Jordan Ayew, I talked quite a lot about him after the Wolves game, because of course he was great in that game. And actually here, I'm going to give him a 7 because he was the hero. You know, we were obviously struggling to break Grimsby down. Last few minutes or so, he pops up in the area from that set piece from Jeffrey Slupp, which of course was a fantastic delivery. And even though Ayew isn't the tallest player, the fact that he, you know, jumped higher than any of the defenders, any of the other Palace players, and just headed it goalwards right in front of the home zone was of course great to see. And, you know, obviously he came on quite late in the game, but you know, you want a player to come off the bench to make an impact, and he certainly did that. He got that important goal in the 86th minute, and obviously ended the game 1-0. So the fact we brought someone off the bench who obviously scored was of course great to see. And going back to the Wolves game, you know, the fact that he's now got 2 goals in 2 games, hopefully that sort of is the thing to actually really push on his season and really helps him to actually get his confidence back, because obviously there was rumours of him going back to Swansea and us terminating the loan. So the fact now he's actually found a bit of confidence, he's found a bit of form, hopefully he can carry that on, because he's shown in the last 2 games actually that if he plays in the right system and if he's in the right place at the right time, he can obviously score goals. So hopefully we sort of look at that and go, actually, if we play to his strengths and play this sort of system which gets the ball to him, then maybe good things will happen. But overall, you know, the hero actually coming off the bench and scoring the winning goal for us. And like I've said, even though he's one of the shortest players on the field, the fact that he was able to jump higher than any of the defenders and the other Palace players in the box was of course great to see. So I do think, you know, scoring that goal itself is worth a 7, you know, considering for the whole game, or the majority of the game, we were really struggling to break them down. But of course, like I said already, you know, we really should have been, you know, ahead in the game anyway, if we'd been actually looking to get the ball into the box quite early on. Now, in terms of just a small summary of the game, you know, we need to be honest, you know, obviously you're going to always be in a sort of a no-win situation in terms of playing a team from a lower opposition. You know, if you thrash Grimsby, which of course you look at Tottenham, you look at Man City, they've absolutely thrashed teams from lower leagues. Obviously that's what you would expect, but then if you don't, it's the end of the world for some. So you've got 2 extremes here, that when you play a lower league side, if you thrash them, that's great, you know, you're a Premier League side, you should do that. But then if the opposition play really well and they make it difficult for the Premier League side, then it's the end of the world for some. So I do think some people are slightly overreacting in the fact that, yes, we obviously managed to get the win, but obviously we should have won it by more, and actually the game was quite boring. But actually, it's not really the end of the world like some people are making it out. It's purely because of how well Grimsby played. It's not the fact that we were absolutely terrible, it's just the fact that Grimsby made a good account of themselves and were obviously very good in the game. But to be honest, you know, you look at the game as a whole, we are actually played relatively well in the game. We got a clean sheet, gave some of the fringe players actually a decent run out. So actually, you're looking at the game, aside from the result, the fact that we've kept another clean sheet, so to keep that defensive solidity, the fact that we've also managed to give loads of fringe players a decent run out. So ignoring the result, the fact that we've managed to do them 2 things alone was of course great to see. And that's obviously the fact that we've got the win, the fact that we've got a clean sheet, that's going to do a world of good for our confidence. And the fact that the player who scored the goal is someone who's been relatively bad before the Wolves game, the fact that he's now got the goal as well really is going to hopefully help us to push on. Because when you have a clean sheet, when you have fringe players having a go, and even though it wasn't the greatest game, nevertheless getting the win, and you've got a player like Jordan Ayew scoring a goal as well, that's really going to do something, you know, for our performance. But aside from that, that was obviously the positive about the game. Obviously there's still a few negatives from the performance, in the fact that this was another perfect illustration of our problems, in the fact that we missed loads of chances in the game. We had 30 shots, I only scored 1 goal, which goes back to the fact that if we had a decent striker or 2, or even a creative wide midfielder who could actually get the ball into the box, which I've been saying, then maybe we'd be a much better team and would be much better off. And you know, you look at this game here and say, yes, it's been very similar to Premier League games in the fact that we've had loads of chances. But if we, like in the Premier League, if we had someone to actually finish the chances, or just had a creative wide player who can actually get to the byline and cross the ball in, then maybe it would have been a different story. But for me personally, and this is something which loads of people have said, and I do agree with it, but I don't think this is necessarily to do with this result. I think this result is good because we've got through to the next round, we've got the clean sheet, got the goal, and managed to break down a very solid team, which of course you've got to give Grimsby credit for. But aside from that, I don't think this should be related in any way, because I do think people have been a little bit too negative about this performance. But in terms of the board, they need to look at games like this, the game against Cardiff, against Burnley, even against Leicester, to actually look at that we can actually create chances, but we've got no class up top, or not necessarily having no class, but we've got no we're not very clinical in the final third. So the board's really got to look at the Grimsby game, the Cardiff game, the Burnley game, the Leicester game, and go, actually, we've got that quality to actually, in the build-up play, to get chances in the box, to have loads of shots, but we haven't got someone who knows how to finish, or someone to finish off them chances. So, albeit this performance against Grimsby is quite disappointing because we had loads of shots, I think it's sort of is slightly different to, say, the Cardiff or the Burnley game, in just to the fact that that's mainly because of just how well the opposition defended. Because if it weren't for Grimsby having that man sent off, they probably wouldn't have played so defensive, and maybe it would have been a different story. So overall, I do think the game did obviously highlight once again that we need someone up top, a new player to come in, or even just a new creative wide player. But nevertheless, we obviously need to bring in some firepower, but I just think some people are slightly overreacting in terms of this performance. But overall, a good performance here, and obviously into the cup, and hopefully we get a decent draw in the next round. So I'm now going to move on to the Man of the Match award, but before I do that and give you my Man of the Match and who I thought the biggest influence on the game, I'm now going to give you the 4 nominations I've put forward for the award. Now obviously, as you've heard in that slightly shorter player ratings than I normally would do, it obviously was a sort of a game where certain players done really well, in terms of Jordan Ayew in particular, and then other players who, were really quite wasteful in front of goal. You look at the likes of Sorloth and Zaha. So it was sort of a game of where some of the players played really well, and it was mainly just because of how well Grimsby were defending, why we couldn't get through. But then on the other hand, people like Sorloth, like Zaha, the reason, yes, you could say it was a little bit to do with Grimsby defending, but actually you could look at it and go, actually Sorloth was a little bit wasteful in front of goal, and then Zaha was a bit selfish. So actually it was a performance where, yes, we managed to get the win and managed to go through to the next round, but obviously there's, like any game, there's negatives and positives to take from the game. And I do think overall, the fact that we got the clean sheet and we were able to put in a relatively good performance, considering the circumstances where, of course, Grimsby were playing so defensively because of being down to 10 men. The fact that we managed to, sort of ride that storm and do relatively well and have as many chances as we had, even though it was disappointing that we didn't finish them, that's of course something we need to consider. But in terms of the players that did impress me, obviously I've got a mixture here between defensive and offensive players, but my 4-man list includes Scott Dann, Martin Kelly, Jeffrey Slupp and Jordan Ayew. So in terms of Scott Dann, obviously I've talked already in the fact that he hasn't played in quite a while because of that injury, but even though Grimsby Town didn't necessarily attack us and didn't really put us under much pressure, nevertheless, Scott Dann got a clean sheet, done relatively well. And one thing in particular I was really impressed with, and the reason he's on this shortlist, is just because of the sheer amount of headers he won. Whenever the ball got onto the box, he headed danger away, and obviously was able to contain Grimsby. So the fact that he was able to defend as well as he did, and especially with his heading ability, was of course great to see. And actually the fact that he also was a threat from set pieces as well, winning crucial headers, getting chances in the box. And some of them are ones where the ball's come into the box and he's headed it himself, or other ones is where he's been sort of lurching around that back post, or that far post, sorry, and he's able to head the ball back into the area for someone else. So in them two sort of situations, the fact that he was able to show that he's actually a threat from set pieces, was also doing a very competent job defensively, was of course great to see. So Scott Dann, I was really impressed with his defensive and obviously his defensive contributions from set pieces as well. And obviously Martin Kelly, his counterpart in defence, like I've said already, yes, Grimsby didn't really test us defensively, but the fact that Dann and Kelly done so well as well as they did in terms of just stopping any attack that Grimsby had going forward, and the fact that they done quite well in terms of actually just headering the ball out of danger when Grimsby were getting the ball in the box. So the fact that he was obviously able to do that, of course is quite impressive, and the fact that he's got another clean sheet is of course good to see. But the fact that he also showed that initiative to actually drive forward as well, I think that was obviously quite impressive as well. So whilst Scott Dann obviously had one shot from just outside of the area, Martin Kelly had a few shots, two in particular which, obviously you don't expect centre-backs to be shooting from distance, but the fact that Martin Kelly had that initiative to see that there's no other way we're going to break Grimsby down, so we might as well shoot from distance. So the fact that he was able to do his defensive work, but also show that initiative to actually play in Grimsby's half as opposed to in his own half, and actually just push forward and put pressure on them by shooting from distance, was of course great to see. And as opposed to Scott Dann's shots, which obviously went wide, the fact that Martin Kelly on both occasions forced James McNoe to actually make saves as well really just goes to show how much impact he had when actually he drove forward. Now, in terms of Jeffrey Schlupp, I think, you know, when you consider the likes of Townsend, Sorloth and Zaha weren't really up to it, and they weren't really playing that well, the fact that Jeffrey Schlupp stood up and actually was one of our most threatening players, especially in that first half when he was playing in central midfield, that was of course great to see. And obviously, because he was one of our most threatening players, he had a number of chances in the game. You know, first one where he shot into the side netting, another one where he put in a fantastic cross for Sorloth and obviously he headed wide, and another one where he found himself in the area and he shot too high. So the fact that Jeffrey Schlupp, albeit he was playing in central midfield, the fact that in that first half in particular he was actually finding himself in these really good attacking positions was of course great to see. And to top it all off, obviously I think overall, if he hadn't have done what he did, which I'm going to talk about, probably would have thought, yeah, fairly competent performance from him. But the fact that he delivered that fantastic ball from a set piece to Ayew to head home to obviously get the winning goal was of course great to see. And you know, I've been calling all game for players to put balls into the box by getting to the byline, putting crosses in. So the fact that when we did get a chance, the fact that Jeffrey Schlupp didn't waste it and put in such a good lofted delivery into Ayew, which of course Ayew headed home, the fact that he was able to do that was of course great to see. So the fact you've got a player who was able to combine his attacking threat in terms of his own chances, as well as turning provider for the likes of Sorloth, and obviously for that delivery for Ayew. So the fact that he was able to do that was of course great to see. And of course my final player, Jordan Ayew, it's quite obvious, he's a hero in terms of this game here. Came off the bench, got that winning goal, and you know, in terms of comparing him to our other two substitutions, obviously they done alright in the game, but the fact that Jordan Ayew came off the bench and actually made that impact and made the difference by coming up, by scoring that all-important goal, considering his height as well, he's not the tallest guy, so the fact that he was able to get on the end of, you know, Jeffrey Schlupp's fantastic delivery and get us a winning goal was of course great to see. Now overall, I do think all of these players obviously deserve credit. You know, Scott Dan and Martin Kelly for their defensive performance and obviously their persistence as well to drive forward and actually put pressure on Grimsby, and of course Jeffrey Schlupp and Jordan Ayew for their attacking contributions. So I do think I've got a fair reflection of our performance here in terms of the players selected, and I do think they all deserve credit, and they all obviously, different aspects of their game were really important to us. Obviously it wasn't the easiest game for us, but they were obviously important nevertheless to us actually going forth and getting the win. But for me personally, considering how well he defended and the fact that he's been out for so long, as well as the fact that he proved the threat from set pieces, I'm going to give it to Scott Dan. So congratulations, Scott. You don't get a trophy or certificate, but you do get my sincere congratulations on what was yet another solid performance from you. And it goes back to that point, you know, the reason I've given it to him is just the fact that when you look at the other three players I've nominated, they've obviously played this season. So the fact that someone like Scott Dan, who hasn't played this season through injury and he's only just come back into the side, so the fact that he was able to perform to as high a standard that he did set in terms of his defensive work, whilst also being a threat from set pieces, which is something we've missed recently. So the fact that he was able to do that for me is, you know, the thing that did impress me. So I do think overall, all four of these players do deserve credit, but for me, because of the fact that he's been out for so long and the fact that he defended so well, even though that was the case, and the fact that he's proving a threat from set pieces is really the thing that made the difference for me. But do comment below with your thoughts, you know, who you think should have got the man of the match award, any players you think I missed out, and of course feel free to also share them below. But I do think, you know, overall all of these players do deserve credit, but of course Scott Dan more so. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my man of the match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, Scott Dan and Martin Kelly following the game.
Scott, a tough game today, but got there in the end.
Yeah, it was really tough. Credit to Grimsby, especially after going a man down in the first minute. They played really well and dug in, and fortunately for us, we managed to get that important goal just before the end of the game, which we probably feel we deserve. We had a lot of shots, but they made it tough for us to break them down.
Fantastic to see you back in the first team. How exciting was it to play in front of a crowd again?
Yeah, it was brilliant. Obviously, it's been 12 months now, just over 12 months since I played at Selhurst, and it's been a long time coming. I'm just thankful I've got back and I've been able to play. So I've missed it a lot.
And nearly scored as well. Were you inspired by Martin Kelly taking long range shots at goal?
Yeah, I mean they were dropping. Grimsby were dropping deep, defending really well. And a couple of times I think Kel stepped in, nearly scored a couple from long range, and it just sat up nicely. I thought I'll have a strike, and just weren't quite inside the post, but like I say, they made it really tough for us, and just thankfully we got that all important goal in the end.
Sometimes it can be difficult in these games because you might be playing alongside people you haven't played often, but with this back five, 4 of the back five actually started the FA Cup final when we got there. So did that make it a bit easier?
Yeah, I think we've played together, obviously trained together for a number of years now. I know them lads inside out. I'm sure they do me as well. So especially me not playing for such a long time, it was nice to go in and play with faces who I've played with a lot of times before.
Martin, that looked like a tough game. How was it for you?
Yeah, it was really tough, and surprisingly, it was tougher when they went down to 10 men because they just sat in. It was it's all about being patient and sticking to the game plan, not trying to find a wonder goal, and we stuck to it, and it paid off. We got the chance. Great cross off Sloppy, just fed it in, and Jordan headed it in.
You nearly got a wonder goal yourself, 3 times.
Yeah, I would say that, but it was just so much space for the centre halves, me and Dante today. With them having 10 men, they just dropped straight off, so it was easy for us to maraud forward and eat the space up. And when the fans are shouting shoot, sometimes you've got to give them what they want, I suppose. So as long as it was on target, it doesn't matter. But the main thing is we're through to the next round.
Have you ever been in a game with a red card that early before?
Not that early, no, I don't think so. No, so it changes the dynamics, obviously, but they had a lot of travelling fans here today. They made a lot of noise. We had a good few fans as well, so it was a good atmosphere out there.
And VAR, you weren't a fan of it in the World Cup, were you? I'm sure you might have tweeted that at the time.
Yeah.
What did you think of it today?
Well, it's obviously a wake-up call for everyone, isn't it? We need to be told before every game if it's VAR or not, because when you're marking people in the box, there's no holding. When you're going in for a challenge, you've got to be 100% sure. There's fine margins that sometimes the referee on his own can't see. So today the VAR's helped the ref, and he's seen how bad a challenge it was, so sent the lad off, and yeah.
And finally, played alongside Scott Dan today. It's great to see him back in the first team, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. After being so long out, he's been grafting away, trying to get fit. I know how he feels having that injury, so it's a tough old road, and he'll be made up to come and play under the lights at Selhurst, where he's been such a big part of this team. So it was great to have him back and to play alongside him.
Roy, relieved in the end?
Well, it was attritional, wasn't it, really, right from the first minutes when they were unlucky enough to get a player sent off. I say unlucky, it was a red card offence by the looks of it, watching it again, and the referee, with the help of VAR, made the right decision. But of course for the opponents it made it very difficult for them, and it made the fact that they were going to get a lot of players back behind the ball and sort of camp a little bit in their own defensive third and ask us questions, really, can you get through us? And we couldn't, really. We had a lot of attempts, and we made as good an effort to get through them as we possibly could, but all credit to them. They stood firm. The amount of blocks they got were fantastic, and there were some incredible performances defensively from their players, throwing their bodies on the line. And the times we did get through, we hit the post, or we had balls cleared off the line, or we missed the target by inches. But they must be very pleased with their performance. Grimsby, they must be very proud to come here and give that sort of performance, even though, of course, as a spectacle, it's not the greatest, because it's very much attack v defence, and against the defence which is leaving you no space to play.
Yeah, the human emotion of such an early red card in a game like this obviously brings a little bit of sympathy to them, but you're happy that the decision was the correct decision, a red card?
Well, having seen it myself now, in the same way, I guess, as the people who do the VAR see it, yes, it was a red card offence, unfortunately, for the player early in the game. I'm not saying it was a deliberate attempt to foul or injure the player. It just was a clear foul for which you can give a red card, and the referee had no option, really, but to give him the red card when the VAR proved that to be the case.
And just finally, Jordan Ayew, another goal for him, so a positive for you in your match winner.
Yeah, unfortunately, these sort of games don't give you many positives. The only positive you get from a game is that you do actually win it in the end. But 90 minutes of, bashing your head against the brick wall to try and get through and coming up against a team that are obviously clearly the underdogs and are more than happy just to be staying in the game and defending as they did, and they deserve a lot of credit for it. It doesn't make for the greatest spectacle, and it doesn't make for the best viewing as a coach from the sideline either. But the fact is, I must say that our players, they did stick at it. They did try everything. We didn't produce enough skill, I didn't think, in and around the penalty area to create as many chances as I would have liked. But I certainly can't blame them or criticise them for their efforts and the way in which they kept going. And in the end, it gave us our reward with that late goal.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, Scott Dan and Martin Kelly had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Grimsby. But make sure to come back next week for my post-match review of the game against Watford. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.